Sir George was a knight, and by all accounts he was a mighty fine knight. He was brave, he was courteous, he was strong, he was skilled. When the knights held their competitions, he would come first in the jousting, first in the archery, first in the sword fighting. But he wasn't happy. You see, Sir George had never completed his own quest. All of his friends had rescued damsels in distress or fought battles, being victorious over enemies. George didn't seem to have any enemies. Everybody liked him. And so one day, George decided that he would go off into the wide world and find his quest. Sir George wanted to be a legend. Despite the protests of his mother and father and his knighty friends, he set off regardless. And he marched across England, country of his birth. He got onto a boat, he sailed over to France, and he rode across France, and then through Spain, and he rode through Italy and Germany and Holland, and all across Europe Sir George rode on his trusty steed. Everywhere he went, all the people remarked on what a mighty fine knight he was, and how courteous he was, and how brave, and how strong, and how skilled. But no one was in distress. There were no battles to be fought. Sir George had still not fought and won for his quest. So he kept travelling, and he travelled and he travelled and he travelled until he came to the land of Palestine. And there he met a friendly, generous people. Still no one in distress, until he heard tell of a town terrorized by a gigantic lizard, a dragon. And he rode and he rode, and one day he found it. A town where all the people were weeping, crying. And he stopped and he got down off his horse and he asked them what the matter was. And an old man told him that a dragon terrorized their town. And every year the town had to give the dragon a fine young girl. And only by doing this would they protect themselves from the dragon's wrath. They would draw lots in the town to decide which girl would be the one to go and give herself to the dragon to be eaten alive. And they were weeping this year more than any other year, for this year the one who had drawn the bad lot was their princess, the town's beloved princess. She was beautiful, she was wise, she was kind, she was a healer. She healed a whole town with her potions, and now she was to be fed to the dragon. She walked towards her fate bravely, with her head held high, and George begged them to tell him where the dragon lived. And they told him of how many young knights had died trying to slay this terrible monster. But George insisted. Finally, they told him. The dragon lived outside of the town, along the river to the great lake. And there, in a cave on the side of the great lake, stayed the dragon. And so George rode out before them. He rode along the river and he got to the great lake. He rode around the edge of the lake, and there he saw it, the cave. He could smell the putrid smell of rotting flesh. He could see the bones littering the floor. And he dismounted from his horse and he drew his sword just as the dragon came out of its cave. It's lucky George was a brave knight, for the dragon was massive, was gargantuan. As it came from the cave, George saw its green scales shining like metal in the dim sunlight. Its eyes were jet black. Its claws were as big as cutlasses. Its teeth were as big as knives. And its tongue forked out to taste the air. It smelled him, and it came towards him, and lunged, and George was ready, and he plunged his sword, screeching in between its scales, stabbing the dragon as hard as he could. As he did, the dragon bit him on the shoulder, and to his horror, he felt poison rushing into his body. He felt a deep sleep grabbing him. Just before it did, he managed to plunge his sword into the dragon one last time and fell back asleep. Surely Sir George was dead. Surely he had gone the way of so many other knights before him, been killed by the dragon. But this time not so. For he awoke. He awoke at the sound of a soft voice and arms around his neck. And ever so dreamily he opened his eyes, and there was the princess, sitting above him, and she had a potion at his lips, and as he swallowed the potion, he felt his strength regaining. And he stood, and immediately reached for his sword, for he saw the dragon standing still before him. But the princess stayed his hand. "No," she said, "don't worry. You injured the dragon, and when I came I found him dying. And with my potions I have tamed him. You see now, he's as friendly as anything." And for sure, George saw that now the dragon was on the end of a leash, and on the other end was the princess. And together they led the dragon back to the town. It was friendly as a puppy dog, and it lived out its life in the town there as the pet of the whole village. And George and the princess, well, they got married, and he took her back to England, got on his trusty steed, and they travelled back through Germany and Holland, and Italy, Spain, and France, back to England. And they returned to George's castle, and there they lived happily ever after.